But it is above all in Monsieur Dos Casas's Memorial that Napoleon is whole. He can be found there amid a disordered composition and lack of detail that adds still more of the charm of naturalness and ease to this collection of truths. Other memoirs are awaited, and these are perhaps the most interesting. But to remember is one thing, and to write another. There are many lazy people, yet others may have good reason for not having the courage to take pen in hand. If the genuine memoirs of the Prince of Benevent, Talleyrand, and the Duke of Bassano, Marais, should ever appear, and if these memoirs contain what such authors could tell, save for them first place on the shelf of contemporary history. Both were long admitted, sometimes by turns and sometimes simultaneously, to the emperor's deepest thoughts. They are the only ones who were truly his political confidants. Rival confidants, each of them listened to him with different inclinations, and each must remember with opposing interests. The Duke of Bassano was still loyal to Napoleon when fate no longer was. He must accuse fate. Monsieur de Talleyrand will have to excuse it. So many eyes have met during the same times and under the same circumstances that we must not be astonished if so many pens meet the same way. The variety of versions will have more benefits than drawbacks, if only to note the essential points on which the witnesses in a position to be well informed differ or agree. Even repetitions, which show a different face, each has its nuances. No positions were absolutely alike, and this difference is enough to modify all accounts indefinitely. In fact, without altering a historical fact, but in expanding or compressing the circumstances relating to it. How many different aspects can be given to it? Show the same object from different points of view. It will barely appear the same, and yet nothing has changed except the spectator's eyes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Emile, Volume 4. Each of us then, without ceasing to be honest, can show a different Napoleon. The relative truth is the only one that can be asked of contemporaries. I am going to tell mine. This portrait that I attempt with the help of some details that are personal to me must be short. To abridge it still more, I find myself in the position of quoting those who have spoken before me. This is part of my method because in such matters I prefer a witness to a chain of reasoning. Each time that this occurs, I beg that it not be taken amiss. Certainly, it is not a pretension on my part to confirm another's assertion by my own, but rather despair of saying it better. I can admit without malice that it is sometimes the wish to take note of certain accounts, which must not be lost. Chapter 27, Napoleon at 40. To describe Napoleon's person, I go back to the period of his second marriage. It is no longer the Napoleon that Monsieur de Bourrienne followed for so long. It is not yet the one that the writers of St. Helena will depict for us later. It is the Napoleon I knew. Let us begin with the particulars. His height was 5'2". That's not true. He was small but well made. However, his neck was a little short and he had perhaps already too much belly. His tissue was soft and the lymph thick. His skin color was never florid. His cheeks were of a dull white, giving him a face round and pale, but not the pallor that denotes a sick person. I never saw him take to his bed with illness. As he said, neither his head nor his stomach ever bothered him. The only indisposition I knew him to have was a bladder problem that sometimes made him uncomfortable. I believe the doctors attributed this malady to the after effects of old sores, or rather the mange that he had gotten, and which was poorly treated at the siege of Toulon. His chestnut-colored hair was cut short around his head and combed flat. He had a round head, a forehead wide and high, blue-gray eyes, a pleasing expression, a well-made nose, a gracefully formed mouth, and good teeth. His vision was not excellent. He supplemented it with the help of eyeglasses that he always carried. He was extremely sensitive to smells. I have seen him distance himself from a servant who was far from even suspecting the secret aversion that he had incurred during work, and at times the preoccupation, the regularity of his features easily took on a hue of imposing serenity, but in the informality of private life, his smile took on great kindness. He rarely laughed, but when he did, it was with a roar, but it was more by way of irony than from great joy. Moreover, no man's face changed more vividly according to the feeling of his soul. This same look, which had just been tender, would suddenly shoot out lightning bolts. He has wrongly been criticized for the immoderate use of coffee and tobacco. He drank coffee as everyone does. He only used snuff, but he changed the snuff boxes constantly. As soon as he had sniffed, he emptied the snuff box and handed it to one of us, saying, "Go get me some tobacco." It was one of our habitual interruptions. On the chest of drawers in his bedroom, we would find a row of snuff boxes prepared in advance for the day's installments. In the apartments, this errand was the one he gave most frequently to his chamberlains. During the council, I have seen more than one minister seek it as a mark of favor. The criticism made of Napoleon for overdoing baths has more basis. He took too many and took them too hot. It is likely that he owed to this bad habit the premature stoutness that historical painters have hardly spared him. At any rate, it cannot be attributed to indulgence in food, because assuredly this was no friend of the table. He was temperate. He lived frugally and ate quickly. Too quickly for his entourage. Moreover, nature had gifted him with an unusual benefit, that of not being able to overeat when he would have liked to. "If I go even slightly beyond my capacity," he would say, "my stomach at once renders up the excess." When he walked on the paths in his garden, he liked to walk a little hunched, hands in pockets, or else with hands behind his back. He had another habitual mannerism that Mr. de Bourrienne has very well noted. It was in speaking or in dictating an involuntary movement of the right shoulder that he raised at the same time as a slight pinching of the mouth from left to right. This was repeated particularly when he was deeply preoccupied. He slept when he wished, and as he wished. Whatever need he had for sleep, 3 or 4 hours could supply. I would see him get up without any effort at his first awakening in the night to go work, then go back to bed and fall asleep again at once. In summer, he liked to have a midday siesta. Normally, he slept about 7 hours out of 24, but it was always in several short naps, broken at will during the night as in the day. During the evacuation of Leipzig, he was able to sleep peacefully for 2 hours in an armchair. The explosion of the bridge woke him. If he had been resting too long, he imposed some rugged exercise on himself. If, on the contrary, he found himself done in with fatigue, he condemned himself to 24 hours of enforced repose. He called this restoring the balance. He could be untiring, not only on horseback, but also on foot. He sometimes walked 5 or 6 hours straight without being aware of it. Returning from Spain in January of 1809, I saw him ride the distance from Valladolid to Burgos, 23 leagues, at full gallop in less than a morning. His ride from Vienna to Semmering has already been mentioned elsewhere. The distance was 18 leagues. He covered it on horseback in the morning, had lunch at Semmering, and returned immediately. He often went on hunts of 36 leagues In the most arduous days of the retreat from Moscow, he voluntarily left his carriage and, taking stick in hand, walked with the grenadiers of the guard. Chapter 28. Napoleon's character. Those who seek to know Napoleon's private nature through his political career run the risk of harboring a very wrong impression. In this way, you would attribute to him all the faults of strong and violent men without taking into account all the qualities which are inseparable from his strength of spirit. I wish he had said, "I am not evil, but woe to him who finds himself under the wheels of my great political chariot. Once it is underway." These are the words of the theater as a great actor would speak them. But I recognize Napoleon better when we have him say, "Let the night wash away the day's insults," or yet again, "Men are not fundamentally ungrateful." Note that it was at St. Helena that he maintained this indulgent attitude. Far from being evil, Napoleon was naturally good. If he had been evil with so much power at his disposal, would he be reproached for 2 or 3 acts of violence or anger during a government that lasted 15 years? The hot blood of Corsica ran in his veins, but the restraint of command had early accustomed him to moderate his first reaction. He had some difficulty tolerating the contradiction, particularly when things were awkward, if they came by surprise and the proprieties had not been observed. But if he got carried away at times, he recovered promptly. His anger, like that of Agricola, left no trace. You had neither his silence nor his rancor to fear. He thought it better to wound than to hate. Many people know that it is an advantage to be wounded by a generous hand. "I would have such mercy the first time that I am beaten," said the minister de Cray. In truth, the emperor was not angry that people feared him a bit. What he dreaded most was appearing too easy. His outbursts were almost always calculated. "It is necessary," he would say, when he wished to justify what he called his harshness. "It is necessary. Without that, they would come to eat out of my hand." Extremely simple in all his personal habits. If he liked luxury in his entourage, that too was calculated. A great display of pomp seemed to him a necessary measure of superiority, and one which facilitated the actions of government. At home, Napoleon was a sure friend and the best of masters. His personal conversation was full of charm and originality. No matter what subject he dealt with, he never failed to bring an element of cheerfulness to his observations. He liked to abandon himself to a friendly informality. The English noticed that even on the Northumberland, he learned that the Captain Batts, who was of the crew, had once fought against him with Sidney Smith at Saint-Jean d'Acre. "So, you rascal, you were there," he said to them, taking his ear, and he at once asked for news of Sir Sidney. In his conversation, he was running fire of question, said Warden. "Yes, but in an audience," returns Monsieur de Pratt, "no one listened harder. You could tell him everything. In the heat of conversation, perhaps sometimes he spoke a little too much. His first secretary, Brienne, blames him for having let slip more than one secret this way. His later secretary will not defend him on this point. There were indeed moments when by an excess of strength he believed he could take off his armor with impunity. It also depended to whom he was speaking. What did he risk with the good Monge, with the honest and worthy Montalivet, with the respectable Monsieur de Montesquieu? I speak only here of the men who were not in the habitual bonds of secrecy. Perhaps he had too much faith in the conquest that he hoped to have made of certain individuals whom he prided himself on having won over. Certainly he did not watch his words enough with Fontaine and others of like mind. No domestic service was sweeter and easier than his. He spoiled almost everyone. His Mameluke marries, he wants to pay for the wedding dinner, and takes from his privy purse the means to buy the bridegroom an income voucher of 500 francs on the Great Book. Every year he pays out of his pocket a bonus of 3,000 francs to César, his old coachman who rescued him from the infernal machine. He gave his nurse a good pension. He had given good positions to her children. He learns that his nurse's granddaughter is coming to Paris, and I see him take 10,000 francs in gold from the privy purse for Faustin Poli, thrown to earth by a poorly trained horse, and getting up angrily, he accidentally struck the groom with the riding crop. Trying to console himself for it, he had 100 louis given to the unfortunate groom. He saw the king of Rome's governess distressed that her son had just been drafted. He at once had Madame de Montesquieu follow him into his cabinet to give directly into her hand the price of replacement for the woman's son, and it must be said that the young man he bought back in this manner was the faithful Marchand, who would later follow him to the island of Elba as chamber valet and close his eyes at St. Helena. "When will you marry, then, Menevalo?" he used to say one day to his secretary. It was the pet name he sometimes gave him out of friendship. Meneval at that time was refusing an advantageous marriage because, having nothing but his post, it was distasteful to him to marry a woman who would bring him everything. "Is she young and beautiful?" the emperor asked him. "Yes, sire." "Is she good?" "Yes, sire." "And you hesitate only because she seems too rich to you?" "Yes, sire." "How much has she then?" 300,000 francs, sire." "Oh, very well. I give you as much. Now you are as rich as she. I hope you will never again be so ashamed." Meneval did not make him say it twice, and shortly afterward he was married. On returning from each trip, each campaign, the emperor liked to generously recompense all those who had gone to some trouble in his personal service, but it was always from his personal funds, and the general funds never felt the effects of this. He was as attached to his old servants and old companions as to his old habits. His oldest domestic, a bear, whom I saw enter his service as a groom in the Rue des Capucines in the year 4, and who had followed him to Italy and Egypt, had made concierge at Rambouillet. Additionally, he gave him high wages from the privy purse. He took a bear, the elder, into his cabinet as an usher. His former chamber valet, Ambar, had made concierge at Meudon. He hated change, feared new faces, and clung strongly to keeping all the men who had been trained in his shadow. It was a large claim on his indulgence to have an acquaintanceship going back a long way. He never knew how to break off relations entirely, no matter how serious the reasons compelling him to do so. The friends he could not keep faithful, he preferred to keep as questionable rather than to lose them. Certainly he ignored the fact that there is no hatred worse than that of former friends, but if he had the presumption to believe himself above such resentments, he paid for it too dearly. Examples of his political generosity are not lacking. Who has not heard spoken of the mercy granted to the Polignac brothers, the pardon of the Prince of Hatzfeld, etc.? For myself, I did not know the following. I take it from a memoir which fell into my hands. Senator Lajuine found himself compromised in 2 successive conspiracies. Napoleon did not even have him questioned, despite the fact that he disliked Lajuine. Here are some examples of another kind of generosity. I did not know a quarter of his acts of personal charity, but my list already seems too long to be inserted here. A fragment of it is sufficient, and may no one accuse me of betraying the secrecy of charity. The fault lies with those who have made such revelations necessary. In fact, I will only name people who are no longer living. For example, Napoleon gave from his pocket to Madame de Pont, sister of the former surgeon of the king, 600 francs. To Monsieur de Marbeuf, lieutenant of the 25th Dragoons, 12,000 francs. To Monsieur Jacques de Juigné, 12,000 francs. To the aide-de-camp Juigné, when he was ill, 6,000 francs. This list goes on. I stop because this must end, and I have yet 3 witnesses to be heard. As they are not to be doubted, they will serve to sum up Napoleon's character. In a court of law, witnesses are necessary. When we accuse someone in history, it is above all when we praise someone that we must have them. Number 1, Monsieur de Bourrienne's testimony. Napoleon was neither malevolent nor vindictive. When he had a bad-tempered reaction, it passed like a cloud and expended itself in words. ... I can verify that he was sensitive, good, capable of pity, and in private life he was good-natured. Yes, good-natured, and full of indulgence for human weakness, which he knew how to appreciate. 2, the former Archbishop of Malines de Prat testimony. Napoleon has been portrayed as a man-eater, a brutal and ruthless soldier. Nothing could be further from the truth. His bark was worse than his bite. The storm clouds dispersed in a hail, a hurricane of words to which he himself attached no importance the next moment. I have heard him say, following a fierce outburst against one of his relatives, "The poor wretch. He makes me say what I do not think and what I would never have meant to say." A quarter of an hour later, he would call back those he had abruptly dismissed and return to those he had offended. I have had this experience. 3. Count Pasteur will furnish us with the last lines in his Apologia. I take them from a brilliant speech he made on behalf of the Philanthropic Society of Paris. When from the Tiber to the Nile, from the summit of the Cordillera to the depths of Dalmatia, all speak of his glory. We privileged recipients of his blessings, voices of the unfortunate, we will say, he loved us. He helped us. May his name be forever blessed in the poor man's hut, as it is honored and respected in the palace of kings. Chapter 29. His great qualities, his passions, and his weaknesses. I do not believe it necessary to go on at length about the superiority of his intellectual faculties. They showed in all his actions in every way. His skill in the art of war is the outstanding quality that was least disputed during his lifetime. It was, however, attributed to good luck, but his detractors have died seeing him undergo the great test of setbacks. Perhaps his administrative superiority is more to his credit. Certainly, no one admires more than I his genius for war, his amazing activity, his admirable gift of stirring crowds and finding order in disorder. And yet this great man seems to me greater still as an administrator than as a general. Senator Fontaine has already proclaimed that his renown as a conqueror will in future be the smallest part of his glory. I know a man of much intelligence who went still further, separating the general from the emperor in Napoleon. Monsieur Hoffman claimed that to a certain degree the general could be accused of having dethroned the emperor. Great qualities all have their reverse side. Napoleon made the mistake of trusting a little too much in his strength, and I think part of this passage of Plutarch can be applied to him. It was difficult to distract Alexander from whatever he wished to do because fate bowed to him in all his undertakings, made him whole and firm in his opinions, and the vastness of his courage made him persist invincible in all things once he had begun them. As for what are called vices, Napoleon had none. Long have the satirists trampled on his grave, and each of their cries has only made known one of his fine qualities. Assuredly, he made mistakes. Obviously, he made some since he was defeated. But whatever dissection he is subjected to, the scalpel's curiosity will be lost in the number of enemies that overpowered him and the affections that betrayed him. What does it matter that astronomers discover spots on the sun? People will see only its brilliance still. Napoleon was great enough to have weaknesses, and he had them. But almost all that the chroniclers of the antechamber have published on this subject is tainted with malicious gossip and exaggeration. It must not be forgotten that Napoleon was generally very reserved with women. He never attacked. He was rather on the defensive. An individual of a serious nature assures us of this. Napoleon was in the habit of saying, chastity is for women what bravery is for men. I despise cowards and immodest women. With such sentiments, Napoleon could only truly be involved with unscrupulous love affairs. Military life may have had its licenses, court life may have had its own. The moral of our operas is not sung in vain. Nothing is so pleasing to the eyes of beautiful women as the courage of warriors. The return of the hero, borne back by victory, pleases them even more. But the brief distractions resulting from it could only have lightly grazed Napoleon's heart. However, 2 or 3 somewhat serious intimacies cannot be glossed over in this way. Let us hasten to say that the persons who were the object of them, as good as they were beautiful, deserved the title of friend more than that of mistress. In those days, these liaisons were not known. They had no influence on political affairs. No scandal resulted from them. They only began to be suspected long afterwards, because everything is known at court. Ladies can never escape the light that a great prince throws on them. Like Semele, they are burned in the fires of Jupiter. Therefore, some names have already been published. Some veils have been lifted. I wish to say nothing in this regard, and curiosity loses nothing thereby, because I willingly admit I was not much initiated into this sort of secret. What is certain is that Napoleon left 2 illegitimate sons. He already had them when he married Marie Louise. Their birth amply contradicted Josephine's futile allegations and contributed more than a little to the divorce in making Napoleon aware that he could have an heir by a second wife, younger than the first. This proof established and the second marriage consummated, I heard no more said about other children out of wedlock. Let us return to the 2 who were the King of Rome's precursors in this world. The first, dating from 1806, is the son of a Lady Eleanor, whom Napoleon only met once at a fancy dress ball. The child was taken away from its mother and raised secretly under the name of General Macon, who had been killed in the preceding campaign and who left no one to carry on his name. Monsieur Mathieu, a former lawyer and the father-in-law of my friend Meneval, was happy to be his guardian. I saw Léon Macon at Meneval's in 1822 for the first time. He must have been 14 or 15, and I cannot say how moved I was to see living again in this child all the features of young General Bonaparte himself, almost exactly as I saw him for the first time in 1796, presenting himself to the military staff in the Rue des Capucines to take command of the Army of the Interior. The other son must date from the time spent at Schönbrunn in the early months of 1809. He was the son of a young Polish countess, a friend of Napoleon's. The child was raised under his mother's care. I believe Cambyses had been trusted with the title of guardian and the secret of his origin. I have never seen him. A codicil of conscience that Napoleon put in his St. Helena will contains the final arrangements that he made in favor of these 2 young people. The bastard sons of heroes do not need to be legitimate in order to inherit their glory. It depends on them. I do not believe I should affect a too marked reserve over these subjects, yet I hasten to end this chapter. The testimony of a worthy man will help me to finish this. Here are the terms in which the King of Holland felt he must speak of his brother Napoleon on this subject. Husband of a first wife much older than he, Napoleon lived with her in marriage in the greatest accord. He can be blamed for no scandal. Married for the second time at age 42, he was for his second wife of a perfect courtesy, kindness, and grace, and his concern for her never faltered. Chapter 30, his opinions. His religious opinions were the height of modern philosophy. He was completely given to tolerance. Everywhere that he carried arms, he led tolerance by the hand. Everywhere that he found several religions, he ended the domination by which one took precedence over the others. Faith, Napoleon would say, is beyond the reach of law. It is the most personal possession of man, and no one has the right to demand an accounting for it. As for belief, In The Immortality of the Soul, his chaplain tells us that he never heard Napoleon speak of it without the deepest conviction. I can add that he saw the immortality of history as a foretaste. Moreover, Napoleon congratulated himself with Monsieur de las Casas that his moral opinions were not of a nature to prevent him when, in imitation of the ancients, he wished to elude the displeasures and obstacles of life. As for his political opinions, they were liberal, but I will not dissemble the apparent contradiction of his actions and biases that a jumble of times, principles, and men inspire in the new constitutional school since 1814 requires that I explain myself. Cato himself found that it is always difficult to give such explanations to men of another century than that in which one has lived. Napoleon's political education, begun with reading the writers of antiquity, was completed in the camps of the Republic. The early impressions were never erased. Like Caesar, Napoleon had been a Republican before being emperor. And like Caesar, he was perhaps the only Roman who retained some aspect of republicanism under the empire. In the informality of private life, memories of his patriotic youth stirred constantly and in all guises. If he was unconsciously humming a tune, it was Allons enfants de la patria, or Let us watch over the safety of the empire. If a tragic monologue came to mind, it was the Romans of Corneille or Voltaire that provided his favorite selections. In the best passages of his imperial speeches, we find a host of expressions and turns of phrase that could well pass for echoes of the Republican style. However, after his rise to commander-in-chief, he feared nothing so much as revealing the opinions of his bygone youth, and his policy in this respect went so far as to cultivate and even seek out men of opposing opinions. He acquired this false sense of shame on his arrival in Paris towards the middle of the year 3, transported too abruptly from the bivouacs of the army in the Var to the gilded salons of the Thermidorian reaction. He could not defend himself against all the prejudices that assailed him. This society called itself the Society par excellence, the Society of Supreme Good Taste. How could a young man not have believed it to be the voice of genuine opinion? It was here that he heard for the first time that the Republic was not defensible, that the Reign of Terror had killed it, that it was merely a system of dupes and ambitious men without means, that anyone of good company was breaking away from it, etc., etc. Not being able to resign himself to appearing in this society as a man of bad taste. Napoleon then began to keep his opinions to himself. Recognized some months later as the foremost general in Europe, he saw no need to date his life further back than the day of his first victory. At least he had this illusion, and soon the steep height of such a lofty position brought out the man above the doctrines. But if he no longer thought of making triumph a cause he considered as abandoned by the elite, he also never wanted to give it up. If men of opposing causes found him accessible and favorably inclined, it was only in relation to them personally. By reason of their own merit and the generous biases he willingly granted in their favor, but not to the profit of their opinions nor their systems, which he never ceased to treat as enemies. The reconciliation of all men of worth with the interests created by the revolution and the fusion of all kinds of superiority in a purely national system became his favorite idea. This was the modification his Republican ideas underwent long before the calculation of his own interests had led him to listen to what could also work to his advantage. By the 18 Fructidor, in the face of the coup d'etat, by which the directorial power changed hands so easily, he was no doubt led to believe that an 18 Brumaire would be equally easy, and perhaps he was yet a Republican if, in taking up a scepter at St. Cloud, he believed at that early stage that he was only seizing dictatorship. In any case, one point is indisputable. Once embarked on such a course, he could only do so with the support of the majority of the nation. This seductive high society of which we have already spoken was that which proclaimed louder than ever that public opinion was disgusted with the ideas and men of the revolution and that a new government was necessary. And it is here that we must recognize to what extent this aristocratic influence, so powerful in Napoleon's predisposed mind, found itself counterbalanced by the very opposition of his opinions and his true personal feelings. While appearing to listen to detractors, he never let himself deviate from his system of transaction. If personal freedom lost its public platform, at least it retained an essential safeguard: equality of rights. Equality of rights was everything in Napoleon's eyes. He saw all the good of the French Revolution expressed there in a single phrase, and he brought great honor on himself by keeping this vital principle safe and sound. He overestimated the gratitude that would one day be his for this, while the orators of the counter-revolutionary party proclaimed from their side that his greatest triumph for posterity would be having defended against all rebellions of the human spirit a social order about to disintegrate. As for the running battle that Napoleon waged against ideologists, it is enough to remember that there is ordinarily little agreement between great kings and philosophers. Thomas assures us that their greatness is shocked and repelled. Was it not said of Mirabeau himself that he loved liberty, provided he remained its absolute master and nothing held out against him? Perhaps Napoleon had that in common with Mirabeau. I will not undertake a justificative paper on this subject here, but I had to clarify the internal struggle that has always existed between the opinions of the man and the exigencies of the throne. Chapter 31, Conclusion. The positions that posterity assigns are subject, like all others, to the whims of chance. Woe to the reputation of a prince whose enemy outlives him. Montesquieu. After having undertaken events where a large number of men are always sacrificed and schemes where great ills are always inevitable, woe to the prince forced to leave the account of them to the discretion of the resentments he did not have time to satisfy or to punish. All writers, says Dr. Johnson, rush to serve up witnesses against the victor. Responds Voltaire, it is not that men of letters are more cowardly and more base than courtiers, but their cowardice remains because it has the fault of being written. Cardinal Richelieu himself was not insensitive to the misfortune of a great man whose reputation remains at the mercy of his enemies. He is as much blamed after his death as he would have been praised had he lived. It is easy to accuse those who are not in a position to defend themselves. Once the tree has fallen, all run to its branches to chop it up. Good or bad fortune depends on the final period in life. Good and evil alike pass on to posterity, and the maliciousness of men believes more in the one than in the other. It was in defense of the famous Volstein that Richelieu put up this protest. The observation lives on. It is timeless and has just found its place here, but a protective refuge against the injustices and contradictions of hasty judgments is fortunately open to Napoleon in the posterity that is now beginning. Duclos observed in his youth that those who had lived under Louis XIV and those who had outlived him were the least favorable to him. But he adds that the negative feelings were erased insofar as those who had misfortunes to blame on this reign disappeared. It will be the same with Napoleon. The more that contemporary resentments fade, the better he will be known, and the greater he will appear. How many people will be saved on his plank in the great shipwreck of oblivion? Everything down to his imperial almanac becomes a page of history. At the head of this yearly drama, we will look for the cast of characters and the names of the actors. It is the greatness of events that provides background for actions. It is the importance of the role that alone affixes the seal of immortality to proper names. Are not the names of history common ones? Look at the great of lesser centuries, how briefly they last. It is barely the illumination of an evening. The generation after them cannot distinguish them from the crowd among whom they lived. The fireworks are over. The lanterns go out one by one. And in the darkness which comes at once, we can scarcely see white smoke evaporating. The fog becomes thicker and thicker as posterity moves further away. It would take a volcano to spew fire that can be glimpsed through this deep night, and the volcano whose gleam illuminated the great figure of Napoleon will long burn.